Most stories of power and privilege begin with wealth. Cars that shine brighter than the sun, homes that stretch across acres, and champagne that flows like water. But this story begins with something far smaller. A whisper that turned into laughter, and laughter that cut deeper than any blade could. She was a waitress. Her name was Emily. No fame, no fortune, just calloused hands from long shifts and a tired smile she wore to survive. That night she wasn't simply serving drinks. She was serving people who believed she didn't matter. And when the glass shattered at her feet, the room didn't gasp because of the mess. It gasped because of what followed. A girlfriend of one of the city's richest men raised her voice so high, so sharp, that even the chandeliers seemed to tremble. She humiliated Emily so brutally that the laughter around her table turned into silence. But what no one in that glittering hall knew was that Emily wasn't just a waitress. And within 24 hours, she would walk into the boardroom, holding the power to silence them all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. At the heart of this story stand three names. Clarissa, just a waitress in the eyes of many, but in reality, a young woman carrying more weight on her shoulders than anyone in that glittering ballroom could imagine. She moved quietly, almost invisibly, through the Blue Crest Hotel's grand charity gala. The chandeliers sparkled above her. The air was filled with the sound of clinking glasses and soft music, yet she felt every stare as if it pressed against her skin. She had learned to survive on silence, to make herself smaller in rooms where she was treated as less. What they didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that silence can hold more power than a scream, and hers carried a secret that could rewrite the very foundations of wealth and power in that room. Then there was Vanessa, the millionaire's girlfriend. To the crowd, she was dazzling. Her gown shimmered as though it had been woven with gold, her every gesture deliberate, her every word designed to cut deeper than diamonds ever could. She thrived on attention, demanding it the way others demand air. Her laugh could command a room, but it was often at the expense of someone else's dignity. She didn't just believe she belonged at the top. She believed the world beneath her feet was built solely to hold her up, and tonight she would make that belief known in a way no one could ignore. But arrogance is a dangerous thing because when the ground begins to shift, those standing tallest have the farthest to fall. And finally, Ethan Ward, the man whose name alone could move markets, whose family empire stretched across industries most people couldn't even name. To the outside world, he was untouchable, the heir to a conglomerate that had been in power for generations. But behind the polished smile, Ethan was a man fighting shadows, family expectations, whispers of old betrayals, and secrets that threatened to claw their way into the light. He walked through that ballroom as though he owned it, yet he knew deep down that not everything in his world was his to control. What no one expected was how the lives of these three, Clarissa, Vanessa, and Ethan, would collide. Because Clarissa wasn't just a waitress, she carried a truth that, once spoken, had the power to set fire to everything the Wards had built. And the night of the gala was only the beginning. The music swelled gently through the Blue Crest ballroom, violins painting the air with elegance. Waiters weaved in and out of the tables, silver trays balanced carefully in their hands. Clarissa moved among them with quiet precision, her eyes lowered, her steps measured. She had done this 100 times before, but tonight every step felt heavier. The glitter of diamonds and the perfume of wealth lingered in the air, a world she could touch but would never belong to, or so they thought. At the center table, Vanessa leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed, lips curling into a smile that promised cruelty. As Clarissa placed a glass of champagne before her, the girlfriend of the city's most powerful heir struck. Her words were sharp enough to cut the music itself. "Is that the best service this hotel can offer?" The words sliced through the air, and the ballroom froze. Laughter rippled, quiet at first, then bolder, spreading across the tables like fire catching dry leaves. Some guests hid their smiles behind champagne glasses, others whispered behind manicured hands. Vanessa reveled in it, her laugh the loudest of all, her eyes locked on Clarissa with the kind of satisfaction only cruelty can bring. Clarissa stood there, her face betraying nothing, though the heat of humiliation burned deep beneath her calm exterior. She simply lowered her gaze, collected the empty glasses, and turned with quiet dignity. And that calm, that silence, became the talk of the room. Whispers floated like smoke. Why doesn't she fight back? Doesn't she have any pride? They couldn't understand it. To them, silence meant weakness. But Clarissa knew differently. Her silence was not surrender. It was strategy. Because what no one in that glittering room realized was simple. Clarissa had been preparing for this moment for months. Long before the chandeliers of the Blue Crest ballroom ever reflected in her eyes, Clarissa's world looked very different. She grew up in a modest neighborhood where the streets were cracked, the nights were long, and opportunity rarely came knocking. Her mother, her anchor, was a woman of quiet strength, but illness had carved years off her life too soon. Clarissa often returned home from school to the sound of labored breathing, bottles of medicine lined neatly on the kitchen counter, and the weight of bills that never seemed to shrink. It was in those moments, folding hospital invoices and counting every dollar, that she learned survival was not just about endurance. It was about preparation. Each sacrifice hardened her resolve, but it also planted something deeper, the belief that one day she would not be the one bowing her head in silence. To keep them afloat, Clarissa took jobs wherever she could, waiting tables, scrubbing floors, stocking shelves. By the time she was old enough to wear the black uniform of a waitress at Blue Crest, exhaustion had already become her closest companion. She worked double shifts, often skipping meals, sometimes skipping sleep, all to make sure her mother had enough to survive another week. Yet beneath the tired smile and calloused hands was a mind that refused to be broken. While others saw just another girl in an apron, Clarissa was quietly building something. Each night, after long hours on her feet, she traded the clatter of dishes for the quiet hum of fluorescent lights in a community college classroom. Finance, law, subjects that seemed galaxies away from her reality, but ones she mastered piece by piece. No one in that ballroom knew it yet, but Clarissa was not powerless. She was prepared. Ethan Ward's name wasn't just attached to wealth, it was wealth. His family's conglomerate stretched across industries like steel roots beneath a city, construction, pharmaceuticals, technology, banking. To the world, he was the face of a dynasty built on power and precision, a man who could change the course of markets with a single signature. His fortune bought him more than luxury. It bought silence, loyalty, and in some cases, fear. People admired him, yes, but admiration of that scale is often mixed with resentment, and resentment, when left unchecked, always finds its way to the surface. On that night at the Blue Crest Gala, Ethan's polished smile hid a truth few in the room dared to acknowledge. His empire was not as unshakable as it appeared. Cracks had begun to form, and some of them sat across the very tables where the champagne glittered. Vanessa, at his side, played her role flawlessly, or at least she thought she did. She wasn't just a partner, she was a performance. Every laugh, every glance, every cruel remark sharpened her presence, as if to remind the world she belonged in wealth. But behind closed doors, her position was more fragile than she knew. Board members whispered doubts about her influence, her arrogance, her recklessness. Ethan defended her, but even he knew the cost of aligning too closely with someone who thrived on enemies rather than allies. For every smile she cast across the ballroom, there was an equal glare of distrust aimed her way. The guests applauded their glamour, but beneath the applause lurked questions Ethan couldn't silence. And what neither of them knew, what none of them could have predicted, was that one of those enemies wasn't seated in the boardroom. That enemy was already serving drinks at his table. The laughter had not yet faded when Vanessa leaned forward, her voice carrying over the music and chatter with a deliberate sharpness. A glass of champagne had toppled during her mocking display, golden liquid dripping onto the floor, splashing across the hem of her gown and her glittering designer shoes. But instead of brushing it off with grace, she seized the moment to wound deeper. Her words rang out like a gavel in a courtroom. "Clean this up, on your knees, right now." The ballroom went silent for a breath, then burst into cruel laughter once more. Some laughed because they found it amusing, others laughed because silence might make them complicit. Clarissa stood frozen, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on her, her dignity cracked beneath the sound of their voices. Yet she knelt, quietly, her trembling hands dabbing at shoes that cost more than a month's rent. Vanessa tilted her head back, savoring the attention, basking in the illusion of power. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside her but said nothing, his silence striking Clarissa more sharply than Vanessa's command. Around the room, whispers grew louder. Why doesn't she say anything? Isn't she ashamed? Clarissa rose slowly, excused herself with nothing more than a soft apology, and disappeared behind the grand doors that led to the staff corridors. To most in that glittering room, it seemed like the end of the story, the final humiliation of a woman too small to fight back. They believed the laughter had crushed her spirit, that she had been broken in front of them all, but they were wrong, because later that night, when the laughter had faded into memory, Vanessa would regret every single word. The following morning, the opulence of the Blue Crest Gala was replaced by the sharp sterility of Ward Enterprises' boardroom. The long mahogany table stretched like a battlefield, each polished chair occupied by men and women whose fortunes and reputations were tied to Ethan Ward's empire. Papers rustled, pens clicked, and tension hummed beneath the surface. For weeks, whispers of fractures in the Ward dynasty had circulated, and today the board had gathered, nervous, expectant, for answers. At the head of the table, Ethan sat with his jaw tight, concealing the unease that gnawed at him. At his side, Vanessa leaned back with her familiar smirk, certain that her influence would finally be secured, certain that last night's display of cruelty had only cemented her dominance. The directors exchanged wary glances, uncertain of what was coming, and then the doors opened, all heads turned, and the last person they expected to see was the waitress from last night. For a moment the room held its breath. The air shifted, heavy, as if the weight of truth itself had just entered with her. Clarissa stepped inside, not in her uniform of black and white, but in tailored attire that told a different story altogether. Her presence silenced every whisper, every smirk, every assumption. Vanessa's laughter faltered, her smile thinning into disbelief. Clarissa didn't rush, didn't stumble, didn't shrink under their gazes. She walked with the quiet composure of someone who knew exactly why she was there, and though no one in that boardroom could yet grasp it, what was about to unfold would change the empire forever, because Clarissa had not come to serve, she had come to be heard. The silence in the boardroom deepened as Clarissa laid a folder on the table, her hands steady, her gaze unflinching. Every eye followed her movements, confusion mounting like a storm. When she spoke, her voice carried no bitterness, only the calm weight of truth. She told them she was not simply a waitress from the Blue Crest Hotel. She was Clarissa Hale, daughter of Richard Hale, the late co-founder of Ward Enterprises. The revelation cracked through the room like thunder. For years, the Ward family had carried on the empire alone, believing Richard's legacy had been buried with him. But Clarissa's mother, ill, overworked, and fiercely protective, had hidden the truth, shielding her daughter from a world of greed and betrayal. All while raising her in silence, scraping together pennies, and carrying secrets that could topple dynasties. Clarissa slid the documents forward, birth certificates, legal filings, the proof of a silent share signed decades ago and never dissolved. Gasps erupted around the table, papers rustled with frantic hands, and whispers swelled into disbelief. Directors leaned closer, eyes darting between the documents and the young woman standing before them. Vanessa froze. Her earlier smirk evaporated into pale stillness. The woman she had humiliated, the woman she had ordered to her knees, was not powerless after all. She was an heir, one with a legitimate claim to the very empire Vanessa hoped to control. Ethan's expression darkened, torn between shock and the realization that the balance of power had just shifted forever. And as Clarissa stood silently, letting the weight of her identity settle over the room, one truth became undeniable. The waitress had just become their equal. The boardroom erupted in murmurs, the weight of Clarissa's revelation rippling through the air. Vanessa, desperate to regain her footing, shot up from her chair, her voice sharp and trembling. "She's lying," she declared, her words slicing through the whispers. "She's just a servant, nothing more." But her defiance rang hollow, a fragile echo in a room already convinced by truth. Clarissa did not flinch. She opened the folder again, sliding forward notarized signatures, court seals, and documents no lie could erase. The directors leaned in, scanning every page, their nods and widened eyes confirming what Vanessa refused to accept. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. Recognition that the woman they had mocked in whispers now held a rightful place among them. Ethan sat in stillness, the mask of control slipping from his face. His gaze shifted between Vanessa and Clarissa, anger sharpening with every second. For years he had defended Vanessa's cruelty, dismissing the unease of his colleagues, excusing her arrogance. But in this moment, he saw the cost. Vanessa's pride had not only humiliated a stranger, it had humiliated him. Around the table, the balance shifted, the director's eyes no longer fixed on Clarissa, but on Vanessa herself. And as realization settled in, Vanessa's humiliation mirrored the very scene she had staged the night before. The laughter was gone, replaced by silence that cut sharper than ridicule ever could. The tables had turned, and every eye in the room now judged Vanessa. One by one, the board members straightened in their seats, their voices firm, their expressions resolute. For years they had tolerated Vanessa's arrogance, endured her presence because Ethan's shadow was large enough to silence dissent. But now the tide had turned. They spoke in unison, not with ridicule or whispers, but with authority. They acknowledged Clarissa's rightful claim, her bloodline, her documents sealed in law. She was no longer the silent waitress from the gala. She was an heir, a shareholder, a force they could not ignore. Vanessa's protests grew shrill, desperate, but the chairman's gavel silenced her. In front of the very empire she sought to control, Vanessa was dismissed, her presence declared unfit for the meeting. The doors that had once opened to her status now closed with finality. Ethan sat frozen, humiliation etched across his face. His empire had been shaken, not by rivals in the market, but by a truth that had been serving drinks at his own table. He looked at Clarissa with a storm of anger, disbelief, and reluctant acknowledgement. He could not deny her any longer. The board stood behind her, and the law was on her side. He was forced, publicly, painfully, to accept her presence, to recognize her seat among them. And Clarissa, she did not gloat, she did not sneer. She stood tall, her silence louder than Vanessa's cruelty had ever been. In that stillness was a power no amount of wealth could buy, the power of dignity reclaimed. The room that had once laughed at her now bowed to her authority. Clarissa Hale had arrived, not as a servant, but as an equal. Humiliation had been weaponized against her, but Clarissa transformed it into her victory. Sometimes power doesn't come from wealth, it comes from resilience. The very cruelty meant to crush her spirit became the stage for her strength. Vanessa, once radiant with arrogance, now stormed out of the boardroom, her reputation in tatters, her name a whisper of disgrace among the very people she sought to impress. No designer gown, no sharp remark, no glittering smile could shield her from the truth. Pride had undone her, and as the heavy doors closed behind her, The silence that followed was not hers to control. It belonged to Clarissa. Clarissa did not stay to savor Vanessa's downfall. She gathered her documents with quiet composure, nodded to the board, who now saw her not as a servant, but as a rightful heir, and turned toward the exit. Every step carried the dignity that had been stripped from her the night before. No laughter mocked her now, no whispers questioned her worth. She walked away with her head high, her place in history secured not by cruelty, but by the strength to endure it. And in that moment, she proved a truth many forget. Respect cannot be demanded by arrogance. It is earned by resilience. Never underestimate the quiet ones, for the same waitress you humiliate today may be the one holding the pen that signs your tomorrow. Clarissa's journey was not about revenge. It was about dignity, about proving that resilience can rise from the shadows of cruelty and shine brighter than wealth ever could. She stood tall where others expected her to fall, and in that stillness, she found her power. But what do you think? Did Clarissa get the justice she deserved? Or do you believe Vanessa was simply a product of the world she lived in? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story hit you the way it hit us, don't forget to tap that like button. It helps us reach more people who need to hear stories like this. And make sure you subscribe so you never miss the stories we share every single week.